Have you ever felt like you were stuck, caught in a loop of losing and gaining Gila repeatedly, back and forth? Well, what if I said there was a book that can break you free? It is a book that provokes you to think differently about chess. It challenges you to consider a different approach and urges you to prove or refute ideas. This then is the strength of my system. Book from the Grandmaster Aron Nimzowitsch. In the next 20 minutes, I will explain the first part of the book, especially the chapter, not the whole one, but the chapter 1, called The Center. Let me ask you, what is the center of the board? So we have this diagram 1. This line shown is called the frontier line and is of course to be taken in its mathematical, not in a chess sense. The square marked on the diagram 2 is the midpoint on the board, again, naturally in its mathematical sense. Number 1. By development, we mean the strategic advance of the troops to the frontier line. The process is similar to the advance on the outbreak of war. Both armies seek to reach the frontier as quickly as possible in order to penetrate into the enemy territory. Development is a collective conception. To have developed 1, 2 or 3 pieces does not mean we are developed. The situation demands that all pieces be developed. The period of development should be inspired by a democratic spirit. How undemocratic, for instance, it would be to let one of your officers go for a long walking tour while the others kick their heels together at home and bore themselves horribly. No, let each officer make one move only and dig himself in. Number 2. A pawn move must not in itself be regarded as a developing move, but merely as an aid to development. Without the aid of the pawnless advance would be the correct one. For as suggested, the pawn is not a fighting unit, in the sense that his crossing of the frontier is to be feared by the enemy. Since obviously the attacking force of the pawn is far smaller compared to the fighting power of the pieces, the pawnless advance, however, is in reality impossible, since the enemy pawn center, thanks to its inherent aggressiveness, would drive back the pieces we had developed. For this reason, we should, in order to safeguard the development of our pieces, first build up a pawn center. By center we mean the 4 squares, which enclose the midpoint, e4, e5, d4, d5. Number 3. To be ahead in development is the ideal to be aimed at. If I were running in a race with someone, it would be, to say at least, inopportune were I to throw away a valuable time by, say, rubbing dirt off of my nose or shoes, although I must not be considered as blaming that operation in itself. If, however, I can induce my opponent to waste time by a similar decision, I would then get an advantage in development over him. The repeated moving back and forth of the same piece would be described as an action of this kind. The number 4. Exchange with resulting gain of tempo. The moves just given show in the most compact form a maneuver which we may call a compound one. For why do we take the d pawn? The answer is to entice the piece which recaptures it onto a square exposed to attack. So d4, d5, c4, knight f6 and c takes d5. And now 2 variations follow. If third move, queen takes d5, then knight c3. And if knight takes d5, then e4. So that in either case, white with his fourth move will have made a developing move of full value. Number 5. Liquidation with consequent development or disembarrassment. When a merchant sees that his business is not succeeding, he does well to liquidate it, so as to invest the proceeds in a more promising one. Translated in terms of chess, I mean by this that when one's development is threatened with being held up, one must adopt a radical cure. For the moment black has been able to hold his ground. The queen has not had to move away, but after a move like bishop d2, black would still appear to be in some embarrassment. For the retreat of the queen, who is now again threatened, would cost a tempo. The right course, therefore, is to exchange. Here e takes d4, knight takes d4. Black can now proceed with his development with, let's say, knight f6, and has relieved the tension in the center and is in no way behind development. This relief of tension in the center taken with the exchange is a main characteristic of complete liquidation. As we have seen, the exchange properly used furnishes an excellent weapon and forms the basis of the typical maneuvers. We must, however, give a most emphatic warning against exchanging blindly and without a motive. For to move a piece several times in order to exchange it for an enemy piece of equal value would be thoroughly a typical beginner's mistake. Number 6. As we have already noticed, a free mobile center is a deadly weapon of attack, since the advance of the center pawns threatens to drive back the enemy pieces. The question is whether the haunted knight, losing all control over himself, will have to flit aimlessly from pillar to post, or whatever he will succeed in saving himself, or the tempi for which he is responsible. An example: e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and we play f4. If they take the pawn, our e5 pawn is ready to march forward and attack the knight. Now, when it attacks, you see the knight has no squares left. He tries to hang on to the place of the knight with the queen e7, but we follow the exact same move. Now they move the knight, we develop the second knight, and we are far better in development, and we are gonna win our f-pawn back. Number 6a. Surrender of the center. After moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, and e takes d4, knight recaptures. In the position now Ri that black can, after mature consideration, play move knight f6, since after knight takes c6, b takes c6, possible attempts to demobilize the knight by, say, e5 can be paired with, let's say, knight e4, and if something like bishop d3, then d5. But with this, black will have solved only a part of the problem, namely the little problem of how to develop his king knight, but not the larger problem of the center as such. To this end, the following postulates are necessary. If one has allowed the enemy to establish a free mobile center pawn, the latter must be regarded as a dangerous criminal. Against him, all our chess fury must be directed so that the second rule follows at once. Such a pawn must either be executed or be put under restraint. Accordingly, we condemn the criminal either to death or to imprisonment for life, or we can pleasantly combine the two by restraint would be begun with, let's say, d6 and perfected by knight f6, bishop to e7, castling, rook e8. White on his side will do all in his power to make the criminal e-pawn mobile by, for example, f4, rook e1, etc. Number 7. On pawn hunting in the opening, usually a mistake. Exceptional case of center pawns. Since the mobilization of the forces is by far the most important operation in the opening stages, it strikes anyone who knows this is as comic that the less experienced player should be eagerly plunged into an utterly unimportant sideline, by which I mean pawn hunting. This eagerness may be more readily explicable on psychological grounds. For the young players, never play to win a pawn while your development is yet unfinished. We begin by showing the best manner of declining a gambit, which we can do very shortly since we have already considered some similar cases. Now I have a really good example. The beginners should always decline the king's gambit. After they offer the gambit, you play or by the simple d6, a move which is better than its reputation. For instance, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop e6. After bishop takes e6, f takes e6, f takes e5, d takes e5, black has a good development and two open files for his rooks, the d and f, and in spite of his double pawns, stands better. Also, exceptions of the gambit is allowable after e4, e5, f4, a takes f4, knight f3, knight f6, not however with the idea of keeping the gambit pawn, but rather to subject the strength of white center to a severe test, or to arrive at the center thrust with d5. Number 7a. A center pawn should always be taken if this can be done without much danger. For example, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, knight f6, c3. Knight takes on e4. For the ideal win of the pawn, which the conquest of the center implies, is not high at the cost of a tempo. It is of less importance to keep the pawn. It is the ideal, not the material gain with which we are here concerned. Put otherwise, the win of a pawn anywhere on the side of the board brings no happiness in its train, but if you gain a pawn in the middle, then you will really have something to brag about. For that, you will get the possibility of expansion at the very spot around which in the opening stages the fight usually sways, namely the center. With this, we close the first chapter. Thank you for watching. I will probably do another video in 2 days. I will try to cover these as fast as possible and edit them like this. Really, thanks for watching.